welcome to the Renegade Report. I'm Jonathan.
And Ramon is present. And this podcast, ladies and gentlemen, might sound a bit poppy.
Yep. You may not like this, but it is the COVID-19 protections and precautions we are taking.
I mean, listen, if you want a podcast next week, I don't want
You need to
COVID.
be alive.
I need to be alive and well,
Okay.
and
I've got bad news for you about me.
And the pop guard. Well, I mean, the real essential element of this podcast
Is you.
Yes.
Of course, yes. Of course. So no pop guards on the mics. We'll try to keep our S's, T's and P's down. But other than that, hopefully a interesting podcast. Moving away from the pandemic and the disease, because I'm sure if you're anything like me, you are very much over a lot of that stuff.
However, we are going to speak about another disease and pandemic, which is called modern architecture.
Yes, absolutely.
And
And
urbanism.
actually, in the long term, in my opinion, far more dangerous. And
Well, it has been one of the most destructive pandemics we've had for the past 100 years.
yeah, no. So on a serious note, just a horrible thing overtaking cities worldwide and creating cities worldwide. So to talk about this, we have a guest in studio. Ramon, would you like to introduce our guest?
Yes, our guest is Mr. Tienie Grobler, and he's an architect based in Cape Town. Welcome, Tienie.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Ramon. It's wonderful being on your show. It feels like I've known you guys for years, like one of these one-sided relationships. But waking up with Ramon every morning on the
Morning shot? No,
which
say
is
morning
great.
shot. We need to.
Yeah, morning
He loves a
No,
little bit
I
of
love the
publicity.
news being curated for you. It's just it's an
There
awesome.
you go. I hope you pay me money every month.
Awesome.
No, he's not paying you anything. You don't deserve it.
But Tienie, explain who you are and
Right.
what you do.
So
and
I'm an architect, but I'm more sort of concerned with the urban condition, and which led me into Austrian economics to look at the solutions that might offer. Very frustrated, like a lot of architects and people in the building industry there, with the sort of central planned bureaucracy and how it sort of cuts off our hands, to try to get a good urban fabric going and even to do good architecture. And further, I'm involved with the organization called Free Private Cities, where they look to build alternatives in the world rather than to sort of fight the system. So they would look at to build a free city within a host nation. So it's almost like a free economic zones, but they load it with a lot of more freedoms. So there would be no zoning, no central bank, no tax, no subsidies for cars. And all
Has
of
anyone
that stuff.
bought into this yet?
There's a project in Honduras that's launched and still, slowly sort of going. But I think it's in the years to come we'll actually realize how significant that, was. It's tantamount to starting a new Singapore almost.
Yeah.
And then they're looking to. There's a lot of negotiations with countries, going on to establish more of these zones.
Tell us about city and urban planning, because I know a lot of listeners, viewers may be aware, but I'm sure there are a fair number who haven't really considered this before. They live wherever they live. Why there's a shopping center on this corner, why there's a suburb in a certain place and not in another place, why a high-rise gets built in one place and not another place. These are not things we think about, certainly, even if we know about urban planning, they're not things we think about a lot. I'm just thinking about my drive here today. I didn't really consider about the surroundings. It just is what it is, and people kind of tend to accept the way the city looks as almost coming out of nothing. It just happens. And I suppose what you're saying is it should happen like that. But what's happening with urban and city planning, and what has happened over the past 5 decades?
Okay, well, that's...
Jeez, want to ask him to solve E equals MC squared?
I will.
No,
I will.
I've
Later,
got it. Everything's
Ramon, later.
So firstly, we've been normalized to it. We may be like the third generation growing up with this, so we don't know the alternatives. Only if you go overseas, maybe, or you go to little pockets in South Africa where you have maybe a walkable city with a healthy grain, you realize, wait a minute, this is a much better way to live. So why would we pay a lot of money to go to European old towns and cities to spend our holidays there And, we come back to live in a place like, well, I don't want to badmouth Centurion, or, the urban sprawl pattern we have,
Yeah.
which is everywhere in South Africa. The outskirts of Cape Town, the outskirts of Durban, everywhere you have this, car-dominated city, which is terrible. And it's terrible, like day to day, there's no walkability. Your day is spent in a car. It is... It breaks up neighborhoods. It costs a lot of money. That typology, by the way, is much more expensive to maintain than to live in a city like a suburb in Paris. That typology, or Bern in Switzerland, or all the nice European cities you can think of, is it's cheaper to live like that and to build that fabric than it is to build our sprawling towns, which is quite interesting.
So it seems like you're contrasting. I mean, when you think about European cities, you think old, right? These cities could be. Paris, the first steeple there when I was there was from 800 AD, for example, and it still exists to this day. So these cities have been built over centuries. Joburg's been built over 1 century. What mindset changed somehow between building those cities over centuries and building Joburg in less than a century? Like, what is the ideological paradigm that shifted?
Okay, right. So that's a great question. So there's sort of two ways we can look at the history, but first, I think it's important to say that there's two different ways of looking at how to structure society. The one would be to say we need to tell people what to do, where they should live, how they should act, and the other one would be more of an emergent urbanism that also has a lot of rules, but it's more of based on base rules, and you have a more emergent order there. It's not a ruleless thing whatsoever. It's just different kinds of rules that's much easier to enforce as well. So, having said that, in the history, especially after most of the nice typologies happened before the Second World War and the First World War. So then it was a question of people had their property and property rights in most countries, and it was the interaction of these property rights. That sort of was the base rule, and also a base rule for law, and the interaction of this property rights sort of had a certain typology that emerged. Over time, it will maybe sort out the width of a street or give back to the street or a park or this, or all those ratios sort of emerged out of it. And because you're dealing with complexity and complex systems, it's impossible for you to try to central plan it. It's like centrally planning a rhino. How are you going to do it? It's impossible. So there's a lot of, we can look to nature for a lot of the answers, which we can do a bit later. And there's, while we're at it, it's like the forest doesn't have it's not one tree dictating to everyone where they should grow. They're all in mutual beneficial symbiosis, and there's little rules governing it. And out of that, you've got this immense, robust, diverse, super efficient, typology and ecosystem going on.
People are going to say, all right, but Paris is a pretty city, and Bern and all these other Rome and these places are beautiful, and all the way they're set up seems to be nice. But then you try drive a car through Paris, for example, or through Rome, or any of those places, and you can't in many situations. They're not practical. So it makes sense that someone would come along and they would do something like saying, all right, the street is going to be 4.6 meters wide. So that will fit 2 cars and a bit. There will be a fire hydrant on every corner because health and safety says there needs to be a fire hydrant. Things like that kind of make sense. The grid system works for traffic better than windy roads everywhere. So that kind of makes sense, and that's why we moved away from the old sort of design of cities where we just sort of let them do as they please. Forests example, and we moved into this sort of somewhat designed element. And isn't there a place for a bit of that predetermined design?
Yes, that's that's a great question. That's easily, but where do you stop with it? So this can become a seed that grows into sort of central planning. So there's other ways to regulate stuff like that. So say another example would be like you said, health and safety. So if you would allow insurance companies to rather do that, rather than having overburdensome building regulations and building codes. So the building codes are there, to protect the public mainly. But what it does is it makes that there's no competition and there's no innovation. It's always backwards looking. To register a new project is so cumbersome. You have to engage with this planning system. So it really stifles innovation and competition as well, which is you need for innovation. So look at an example. If you have a house, like in the old days, there were in the street you had row houses and they shared, their roofs would touch each other. Nowadays this is illegal because the fire department would say no, it can cause a spread of fire, which is a valid concern. But instead of them developing like real blunt instruments to sort of organize this organism, we have to look at the cities and communities as organisms because they are super organisms like a beehive and whatever. We're all part of different super organisms. And, to use a blunt instrument to try to, bludgeon this thing into, an outcome you want is problematic. So rather, if you look at out of spontaneously and voluntary, insurance would emerge. They would say, okay, if you insure with me, your premium is going to go up if you don't sort of address this detail and have a fire break between it. And then another insurance company would, looking for business might say, okay, we're willing to look at this innovation or that innovation. And that whole process is much more streamlined and it makes for competition and innovation as well.
So you're saying the different solutions then just, I'm just thinking, I used to play SimCity a lot.
That's wonderful.
And well, I don't know so much because it's very much a central planning type of game. Although you can go wherever you want with it. But I remember having the first sort of version of SimCity, which worked on computers which are now ancient. But the whole idea was, you sort of set up your city in almost square blocks. And then, you had a fire department and a police department every so far distance apart because they had certain coverage. I'm just wondering if we've gone too far as a society in all of this, where we kind of believe that this is the way things need to be done now. And why is it that cities which run just fine, being designed the old way because they were just built in there prior to this change, why is it that we're not having more influence? Because a city like Dubai, you talk about Joburg, has come up in the last century.
Oh, yeah.
But a city like Dubai has come up in the last 25 years. And
it is awful. It is
I haven't been there, so
it is absolutely horrific.
So some people seem to like it. I don't know. I've never been there. I guess.
Yeah, let's look at what cities should be. What is the reason for cities? That might be
sure. I mean, I think I would find Dubai impressive from the perspective that I would arrive there and look up, and it would be impressive in that sense. The high rises, I guess.
You can buy a big, impressive ice cream rather. Look at that.
Sure. So, but at the same time, I think I know the problems with those kinds of places. I've visited New York, for example, and I've stayed in Manhattan, and I could not live in Manhattan.
Unless you live in the old parts, that is the most sought after part still.
Yes.
Before the 1920s planning and
well, if you go to Washington D.C., in fact,
all the old parts in the world are much better. The fabric is good. Not the architecture necessarily. I mean, there's some brilliant architects with amazing innovation but the way the fabric of the city is stringed together, you can't really string all of those objects together to form a city.
But let's get down to brass tacks. I mean, because Jonathan, you made a comment about what about the need for cars? Cars have been probably the most destructive things that have happened to communities across the world. The adaptation of cars as a primary mode of transport in cities has destroyed cities, essentially. When you have human-scaled, walking-scaled cities, people are obviously much happier because they build communities that are based on social connections. If you bring cars in, you actually destroy a lot of the fabric within neighborhoods and communities. And more importantly, you actually have to separate people to accommodate a mode of transport.
Yeah.
So the fact that the cars came into the world destroyed cities. Now, people won't see this, but if you go to Malta which is a very defined space and was built over thousands of years from Muslims to Catholics to the British. It's got different architecture, all made by the same material, which is the stone found in Malta. So you've got different styles, but in the same stone.
It's like Jerusalem.
Exactly. And it looks fantastic because you can't have cars in Malta because there's just no space for roads because it's an island. And that's a walkable, livable city, and people are happiest there. But I mean, Tienie, you might.
Yeah, so cars are one of
more.
the biggest killers of cities, but it's not
Indeed.
cars per se. They are a wonderful solution. I mean, cars are amazing. But the problem is that we don't pay the true cost for them. So they are being subsidized in a whole different, ways. Most, especially in the States, cars are directly, the industries are directly subsidized. The oil industry subsidized. More in South Africa, if you look at it, the land use is subsidized. We don't pay directly for all the roads. It's through our tax money.
Yeah.
We don't pay for the parking that's being expropriated from your property. If you want to have an office, they dictate you must have so many parkings. And it's so bad these days that people would. In a parking lot, there wouldn't even be space for trees sometimes, because if you get an extra parking that you can squeeze in there, it means you can have extra, 100 squares of retail that you can rent out. And the irony is these things are never full. They may be once full on a 24th of December. There's a site, Black Friday Parking, in the States, which looks at on a Black Friday how those parking requirements are way too abundant. It's there's still parking left on that, and so being subsidized, we don't pay the true price of it. But this is very tempting. This goes to show the two ways of thought. So the one way of thought, I would also in the 60s think cars are amazing. That's definitely the way of the future. It's like the veins in a body, it needs to service everything, and let's subsidize it, let's sort of force the issue. But that's the whole point of, you don't have enough information with the central planning. There's a lot of, every time you do this, you break some other feedback loop, and eventually it leads to more interventions and more interventions. So cars have completely hollowed out cities. There's a wonderful picture taken by Elaine, what's his name, Proust, that's of the Capitol Theatre in Pretoria, which is now, it's an amazing building, and the interior is now used as parking. It's literally been hollowed out by cars.
Yeah.
And just to show, these cities are made out of building blocks of neighborhoods. So it's fine if these neighborhoods have pedestrian ways and they link to other neighborhoods, maybe by other transport, cycling or motorbikes or light rail or whatever. And cars are supposed to serve these networks. They're not supposed to go right through the cell or right through the rhino. They're supposed to be on the surround. It's a much better typology. And also, nothing else can compete with it. So say I have now from Blouberg to Cape Town, I want a hovercraft thing, delivering, passengers. But I'm competing against a subsidized thing. So even if my cost is X, he can make more profit than me. I can't compete because I'm working against something that's subsidized. The same with water and energy. For that, it's the same argument.
Yeah.
And then just the last thing about they always say, no, you need to subsidize it because of the poor. But the problem then is because you break these price mechanisms, that means no innovation, and the price doesn't get of those solutions, be it water or transport, never gets sort of beaten down, and so transport's just expensive for everyone. So instead of breaking the price mechanism, you can rather give the poor money. Really, just give them money to say this is for transport. But even better, you can give them money to use however they see fit for it. That'll cost you much less in subsidies, and over time, that sector would the prices of that would be much more compatible. It would be much more affordable, and so you'll end up having to subsidize even less in money.
Yeah, but I mean, the fact that you even have to give the poor people
That would be
money
an interim solution.
to travel somewhere is a failure of
I know.
planning, if for the lack of a better word.
That's just trying to roll back the system to something else. Yeah.
I mean, economic spatial apartheid is not economic. Geographical spatial apartheid is in the news often, and I fundamentally agree with that principle.
Yeah.
The apartheid government craftily put certain people in certain areas with one way in or out, so they had to travel far to get to work because they couldn't be anywhere else during the day, etc. And I fully understand that, but. So you got the centrally planned system that really discriminates people based on geography and on race. So how would, if you were a dictator, like how would you solve the issues where the poor and maybe not even the poor, the middle class and the rich could maybe try walk to work, for example, or use a tram or use a train or use something that fits in with the organic flow of a city rather than sitting to bumper traffic on a highway that cut through the oldest parts of Joburg, and they destroyed all of that in 1930.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Well, once again, I would just say I don't have the hubris to think that I would be able to. I would leave it to people to sort it out. They're closer to their immediate wants and needs, so they'll be able to do it. So the quickly on apartheid, that's a case in point of how they failed with the social planning completely. I mean, the cost of trying to keep that typology alive is huge, and we still live with the consequences of the segregation of people in sort of a monoculture of just residential or monoculture of just office parks or this or that, and they were actually in a very they aren't left with any tools to rectify the situation, or us as a society. I mean, if you look at most townships they don't have full title. Sometimes they can't. There's this wonderful Kaya Land project that you know about of the Free Market Foundation that's trying to rectify that and help people with that. But they can't build an office park there. It's against the law. They can't build up stories or densify or.
Well, I think it took Maponya 20 years to build his mall there in Soweto.
Yes.
Like 20 years of just hard graft.
Yeah. And that also is this whole idea that you have, once again, I like to look at, nature examples. So nature, you have an organism, it'll grow up and it'll mature, and after a while it'll duplicate. It's not going to grow into this monstrosity. The same with a city. A city in a neighborhood, it becomes a healthy size and then it duplicates. If it's allowed, but we aren't allowed to duplicate it. So we can't have a sort of a polycentric city where why can't there be a commercial hub in a township, or why can't there be some residents in certain other places, more residents in the CBD, more residents in the office park, and the city tries, planners are trying to do this, and then they say for 5 years, okay, they're forcing the issue, now you have to, have residential here. Then they say, okay, that's not working. Okay, now you have to have mixed use, and they enforce that. Now they say, no, now you only allow this, and now it's minimum parking requirements, then it's maximum parking requirements. So they're constantly losing to this chess game. Sorry, Jonathan.
No, so I've just been listening for a bit. I don't agree with you guys on cars, so it's a tough one for me. I hear what you're saying around cars and the disruption they create in cities.
I don't want to ban them at all. They just need to co-depend, to co-evolve rather. They didn't co-evolve; it was sort of forced in there.
Yeah, I mean,
they never got the chance to co-evolve, really.
Yeah, I think that's largely true. I think there's a lot of examples of that. The U.S. interstate system, for example, which was, to best of my knowledge, enforced by Eisenhower as an escape system for nuclear holocaust. So, which may come in handy, Ramon, if your position holds. So I do think there's truth to that, but there's also a lot of freedom that comes with personal transport. There's also a lot of realities to having roads in cities in terms of ambulances, for example. I can tell you that, high-rises are the worst freaking thing in the world, from having walked up several in Hillbrow to fetch patients. Those are terrible, especially when the lifts aren't working. But also in cities in Europe, it can be difficult to move people and evacuate people who need to be taken to hospitals and things like that. So I'm not buying we've got to get rid of cars completely. I also think that it's fine on an island like Malta, where it's Malta. It's a small little island. It has limited capacity for humans. It doesn't really have giant population growth, so it doesn't need to spread out. Everyone is kind of content with what they have because that's all they have. Whereas you take a city like Johannesburg, there are not things in Soweto that there are in Sandton. So it's reasonable for people to want to travel that distance. We have a major problem in that example, for example, as an example, where people need to use taxis to get from there. In fact, 2 taxis to get from Soweto to Sandton, because for some reason, taxi mafia ship being the reason, that they cannot get straight from Soweto to Sandton. So cars, for example, would actually liberate a lot of people in that specific scenario. Maybe if you're saying let's roll it back to the point where we all live in these little neighborhoods and everything you could ever want in life is in the neighborhood, but I still don't buy it because IMAX isn't in my neighborhood and I need to get to the IMAX. And I don't really want to go in a tram to get to the IMAX because I don't like you coughing next to me. And I also like my own space.
But
I don't want to ban cars.
Yeah.
I just want to say roll them back to what they would have been.
But you're only saying this because you grew up in Johannesburg. Like
perhaps
if you grew up in a walkable city like Zurich. Zurich is a great example of that. There are cars on the road, but it's quite rare to see them in the inner city. There are trams, which are very good, but people are walking. You see business people walking to lunch or walking home, or school children.
I think
walking
I'm
all over the place.
Excuse the pun. I'm very much the middle road person here, in the sense that I'm saying I get it. I get we need to decar some spaces, but I also think it's not to eliminate completely because there seems to be a problem.
Yeah.
The extreme on either side
cost.
is
If
a
you pay
problem,
the true cost, then then it'll find the right way.
Yeah, the problem is you are paying the true cost because you're saying our architecture is screwed and our central planning is screwed. That's the cost. There you go. You paid the cost, right? We as a society have paid the cost. Our cities are shittier. Right? They don't look as cool.
Me as an individual don't voluntarily pay the cost for that. I'm not.
Yeah.
But it's very simple. Go back home, Jonathan. You've been to my house. I've been to yours. You pay rates for your garage.
Yes.
Right. Which is actually a useless space. It is designed solely to store
keeps
a
my car warm. What are you talking about?
It's designed
cold at night.
solely to store a car. And in Johannesburg, that is centrally planned, you need that car, unfortunately, to get around. But imagine living in an area where you could walk to work or take a short tram ride to work, where you don't need a car, you don't need a garage, you don't need the space that you have to pay rates for, and you can live in a much more organic city. A walkable, livable, human-centric city.
Yeah, although
isn't that something that's like nice?
Sure, but I will note that even Paris, which I love Paris, Paris, walk around Paris at night and the roads are, the sides of the roads are packed with cars parked, and if you walk around at about 5, 6 in the evening, you will find people circling the block repeatedly looking for a parking spot for the evening. So, I'm not sure if we're way past that point already, because even in cities that are inverted commas walkable, people are not walking for them.
Yes, it's hard to roll back because you need a whole ecology of other things to fall in place as well. I mean, you need to have, really have an old typology again where you live above your store or live close to your office, or where amenities is sort of mixed, and once again, it's made out of little cells rather, which are walkable. And you can walk over to another cell, you can drive over to another cell with your car if you like, but it's going to definitely lessen your need and reliance on the car.
Yeah, but even in Paris, it's just you jumping. The CBD is called La Défense, and La Défense is not in Paris, it's to the west of Paris, because they couldn't build high-rise buildings in Paris.
They tried the one which was
it's actually a marsh.
Oh, yes, no,
so
exactly
they had to build an
about,
entire new CBD like Sandton on the outskirts of Paris, and I go through it because my grandmother lives on the other side. But they had to. The fact that they have to build an entire CBD for offices in glass buildings, and people have to travel there to work rather than just using the existing buildings in Paris. Even that is absurd, no?
Is it though? I mean, I hear you, and it sounds absurd, but at the same time, I'm going, all right. a 20-story skyrise that has the footprint of a base footprint of a square kilometer or something like that. No, that's too big. Sorry, half a square K or something like that for a giant office park or whatever it is, giant high rise. Whatever it is, you can fit, for every level you build there, you can fit hundreds of more people in that space than you could in a sort of flattened space. That's the whole concept of going high rise, right? You can the capacity just increases, as everyone loves to say now, exponentially.
That's a very good point. So that's a very good question. I see where you're going with this.
So, So the thing is okay, cool. Paris doesn't do this. Paris goes, we're becoming a business district of the world. There's banks that are going to be centered here. There's a whole bunch of business. We need to. This space currently contains 1 million people. We need to go to 2.5 million people. How do they do that without going? Building these, and I know exactly what you're talking about. And London's got the same phenomenon actually. In fact, there's an incredible photograph. I think of one of the palaces in London, or one of the sort of royal homes in London, and it is a photo in the 1960s, and it's a photo of the palace and the beautiful trees and everything, and behind it London in the background, this sort of flattened area, and you kind of non-bothersome. And then now in the sort of 21st century, the same photograph, but just these sort of sky rises, as has happened also in London I think it's in the east. I might be wrong, but everyone knows where those phallic symbols are being built. There's a giant dildo they built in London. So I get that, but how do you solve that problem? How do you solve the people problem?
First, let's look at what is a city. Why do people live in cities and live in towns?
Okay.
So they want to be, it's sort of the principle of the cities that did well had a way of exploiting the wonderful phenomena of division of labor, where you focus on what you do and me on what I do, and we trade, and we're both so far better off, and that is one of the miracles of trade, and that's maybe accountable for most of our wealth in the human race. So you need to, the more connections you have, the better it is. But you need to connect something that's complementary. I don't want to connect one coffee shop to another coffee shop to another coffee shop to another coffee shop. I want to connect a coffee shop to a hairdresser, to an office, to a school, to a this and a that, and branch out the web of that. So to have as many of these connections possible, geometry just allows for, and you have to get cars in there and out there without severing all of these connections. So there's a certain geometry that mathematically is optimum, to get all of that going. So densification, just for them Afrikaans comes. Densification, just for the sake of densifying, doesn't help if you're just densifying it with a monoculture of a high rise of just residential or just offices. And especially when you look at those buildings, if you look at all the buildings going up everywhere in Cape Town, all the fairly new ones have, they have basement parking, and the first 2 to 5 stories are for parking. And only then they might have some retail on the bottom here in some street, but in most cases not even. So you completely sever the whole reason why there's cities in the first place, to have these little connections for people to sort of densify.
Well, to live well. I mean, you want things
so that you can have division of labor. Yeah,
because you want to have a dense city so that there's more connections being made.
Sort of mass cooperation, to accelerate the economies. Yeah.
But the problem is you're putting people in these glass and steel buildings which are already anti-human. So you need air conditioning to make them livable while they sit at their office. And then you have parking at the bottom, which disconnects them from the street. And then to get into the parking at the bottom, you need to go through a security, and you can't actually access.
They might as well have lived in a virtual world,
So why don't we just build those in the middle of the bloody Karoo? Because they'll be more useful there.
Too far to drive.
No, but you're essentially doing the same thing. You're creating silos of isolated. I'm not even going to call them communities at this stage. Just isolated individuals.
But that is,
and we're living hyper isolated lives.
You said the word. You said CBD. That's the point of the CBD. It's a business district. I mean, if you go to the place in Paris,
it doesn't have to be. It needs to have people.
But Why try plan where business needs to go?
But that term CBD is not a good one. If we didn't touch on sort of modernism and the whole...
Nobody lives in the CBD, right, for the most part. I know there's like now hybrid interpretations.
But that's after sort of modernism and the whole ideas of we're going to design...
is it modernism, or I'm thinking, is it not the American dream that did this?
Because, but modernism, it's quite interesting if you look at the how modernism became very popular and adapted in the American dream and sort of taken up in the universities. There's a guy who wrote a wonderful book, what's it called again?
Don't worry.
Kanzler, anyway.
We will remember it.
He argues that after the First World War, there was a sort of vacuum in the intelligentsia, and that was taken over mostly by socialists. And out of this, also a lot of art houses that sort of they grouped together in sort of almost political organizations. You had the Bauhaus in Weimar, and you had Futurism in Italy, and you had the constructivists in Russia, and you had the Stijl movement in the Netherlands. And these became sort of, political with manifestos, and you sort of belong to them like you do to a political group. And they had a lot of influence. And interestingly enough, they opposed Hitler. Came to rise in that same period, and he preferred classical architecture, or I wouldn't call it architecture. Let's call it
literally Hitler
style. But it doesn't matter if you like it, but if you want to impose it on everyone and say it's like telling everyone you only allowed to wear a silver suit and a V-neck with boots from now on.
Yeah.
So if you and they opposed that. Their plan was to design for the new industrial man, and to sort of mass fabricate quality of living, sort of. And so they were at odds with him, and after the collapse of the Nazi regime, they could boast that they said, no, sort of we defeated, modernism defeated that. And that gave them a lot of clout, and they were taken up in universities, especially in the States. And that universities was, being a sort of revolving door to policymakers, so that school of thought prevailed for a long time there. And then, but it's not only that, and then coupled with the, the other sprawl of, and the car in the US also did that. Just if we touch on universities, most universities, especially with the soft sciences, which I think, it can be a hard science, economics and so, but they treat it as a soft science, and also urban planning and architecture and urbanism as well. So my experience...
It's treated as a soft science?
Yeah, well, they wanted to be a hard science, but they don't... implement the scientific method to make it a hard science. So they would, so we got at university, we would get more marks if something was labor intensive. If you build it out of spoons, and you employ more people, it's great.
Instead of concrete.
Yeah. And there's also at UCT, I recently, a few years ago, I sort of stopped my studies in protest, because one of our assignments was to look at there's a transport-oriented development that's happening, and so the state would build a railway station, and now all of the properties there, values increase, and the state would say, no, that's unfair. Why should your value increase because we, built some infrastructure here? So we had to look at the assignment to come up with novel ideas to sort of undermine property rights and try to expropriate that windfall. That's the stuff they teach you. So it's always been very
Pierre de Vos, your guest lecturer.
No, I wouldn't name names. No, that wasn't him. I don't know him. But But anyway, they left-leaning in general, and that sort of.
But urbanism is an ideology. It's a philosophy of living, in essence, right?
I don't know.
You don't know?
Well, there's two schools. There's town planning, which is sort of more the bureaucracy
modern urbanism. Modern
of the enforcing these, and unfortunately, for a long time across the world, urbanism was sort of taken out of the art schools and sort of stuffed in there, so they couldn't come up with novel ideas. And
why does the hard train go the main route go from the airport to Sandton? right? Because they created a central business district, and the airport they had to build on the outskirts of Johannesburg or near Kempton Park, where no one cares what happens anyway. So, and then the most direct route is a train, right?
But it's hard to, after the fact, to try to rectify these things. I mean, and you have to do it with, rectify a whole ecology of things, so it's hard to roll back.
So I'm not trying to rectify, I'm just trying to show that the plan has always been there. And when they try to rectify it, they just plan more, if you understand what I mean. I mean, the Gautrain, to me, I use it quite often when I go to the airport. It's the best solution we have in terms of public transport, public-private partnership, whatever crap, right? And it works to some degree, but who knows at what cost?
Yeah, the unseen costs.
And it doesn't reach the people that need it the most, i.e. the poor or those that live on the outskirts of the city as well. So the central plan costs a whole lot of money, expropriated who knows how much land from landowners, and then doesn't really give service to those who need it the most. Like, that's the absurdity of central planning.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I mean, there's so many nuances and unknown factors that you can't plan for them all. And these people would think, and it makes sense to them, and you can't really sort of, I have a hate the sin, not the sinner policy, because they're just playing the cards as it as it is. They sort of we all sort of Afrikaans is a nice word for it, aandadig, sort of accomplice with what's happening. We all sort of support this system in some sort of way.
There's also this sorry, Jonathan, if you want to jump in. But there's also this overriding need for efficiency. It's like people are cogs in a machine, and the machine needs to be as efficient as possible. And efficiency means you live over here, you work 20 kilometers away. The easiest way to get there is with a car, so we'll build a road. But if you want to shop, you have to go to the mall, which is another self-isolated hub over here. Like nothing. It's a planner's wet dream, but it is not human-orientated in the slightest degree.
Yeah, not at all. Once again, if you look at nature, I mean, you don't find that in nature. Nature is sort of more decentralized. It is, you can't build a living organism like that. And the hubris to try to do it. So it's back to the two different schools of trying to do it. So, and more interventions just leads to more interventionism. They're never going to win it. It's not the case of we're just going to get the right way to structure society or the right this. You have to completely take a different approach. So that's why we look at, for example, the free private city urbanism that we're looking at. Is we have this, we afforded this whole ecology of freedoms. So there's no tax, no zoning, no subsidies. So what type of urbanism would emerge out of that? So that's a problem we're facing with and trying to sort of design for these cities. But we're sort of more designing mechanism for them to evolve into something. But you still have to put some infrastructure down to get investors there, but it's we're trying to see it as a process rather. We're designing a process and putting it there rather than a sort of end state solution that's sort of fixed. And a lot of new urbanism is looking to. So new urbanism is a movement, and they have these amazing goals which everyone would agree to. You have to be in a walkable city. You have to be energy efficient and sustainable in this way, and people need to be happy and whatever. But just to put it down there as a goal, how are you going to pay for that? Are you going to force it all the time and subsidize it into perpetuity? So it needs to be a process. They can't really adapt with, if the population grows or shrinks or changes over time, or economies change, or so it's not really a response to context enough. It's like the cargo cults. Which in northern Australia, where they tried to lure back these angels that brought them provisions, which was the planes in World War II, that dropped some aid there, and they thought, okay, if we just build these angels like long flat surfaces, so if we build this, they'll come back, and they didn't come back, and they said, okay, we remember there was these sort of cone-shaped things, and they build that, and eventually they build this whole mock airplanes out of reeds and everything, trying to lure back these angels. But it's complete, pseudoscience. You're never gonna, you can't build an organism like that. So,
all right, let's
get like the fake Chinese cities again.
Yeah, I mean, once again, there must be some balance, because New York, much as I wouldn't like to live in Manhattan, is a walking city. You don't need a car in that, certainly not Manhattan. You don't really need a car in Brooklyn either. And it does work, and they do have these sort of high rises. But let's talk a bit about the architecture movement, because cities will take centuries, I assume, to change and new ones to emerge. So architecture, Roman referred to it earlier as a plague or a pandemic. Architecture has taken a weird turn in the past, I don't know, what is it, probably half a century, but really in the last 20 to 30 years. A lot of stuff being built out of concrete and glass and steel, most of which is put together in the most horrible possible way they can. You see buildings being built in, Johannesburg's a good example, Cape Town's another good example, for billions of rands. And then you look at the outcome and you're like, is that the best you could do? And everyone praises the architects and the people involved, and you're like, it's a square block of concrete, folks. It doesn't inspire anything. It doesn't make you feel anything. It doesn't make you want to visit it. What's gone wrong with architecture? Also a broad question.
I think our architects' hands are forced, like I said before. It's a response to the building codes and regulations and zoning restrictions, and has become very cumbersome. So for you to, and there's also limits on the bulk you may use and the heights and this and that. So for you for a developer to make profit out of and there's an immense need for housing and offices and all of kind of that, especially for housing in cities. But cities they're not allowed to densify because of the rules. And so that is just a response to the rules. And that makes that you get these sort of block type of architecture with a lot of setbacks. So it actually doesn't create a healthy street. The whole reason for a frontage of a building is the interaction with the street. So it's not supposed to be these isolated objects. It's fostering the relationship between inside and outside. I mean, that's what a window is, for example. And so the whole idea of a frontage of a house or a building is, how does it interface with the street? What does it give back to the street? Maybe an arcade where someone can walk under the shade, and that's part of a continuous one. Where people can go to. So in my sense, it's just sort of a response for that. And it's also a bit of, the Instagrammability of buildings these days. But I think architects are actually, responding to the, how the cards are dealt quite, in quite ingenious ways and novel ways. But like I said, their hands are forced with that.
So why are all new buildings, why do they all look the same? It's all glass and it's all steel. Different shapes. But mostly square or like fluid-like.
I think it's you're allowed to build this in this volume with all the setbacks and this and that, and so you have to build it full. Otherwise, you're not going to make your.
But why is it made from stone or from wood or from
Well, timber is a great thing. There's
thatch is wonderful. Why always steel and glass?
Yes. Well, if you look at timber, would be a great alternative. It's almost the same cost. It's more flexible. You can do other things with it. But there's also some regulations that's once again backwards looking. And also another thing we need to touch on is there's a guy or a movement called Massive Small, and a guy Calvin Campbell driving it, urbanist, and he argues that the whole problem is that it's not the interplay of a lot of small actors in the building sector anymore. Individuals making adjustments to the house and improvements here and developing this in a neighborhood, maybe together buying up the street, it's not allowed, or together buying up something to make a park or whatever. So now to engage with this whole planning system, it's impossible. There's so many delays. It's you can't do your due diligence because it's written so poorly, the regulations, they conflict each other. So you have to submit something at huge costs and time, only for them to come back to you with a yes or a no, and then it might go, through another cycle and another cycle. Years. It can take years and lots of money. So that makes it only big players can engage with this planning system. So either you get these huge developments or no developments at all. So there's no laced sort of layered quick response to that. I actually forgot what the question was a long time ago.
No, just the building materials themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Timber is more beautiful, it's more flexible, it lasts for centuries, as we can see in European cities, but it's not being used.
I also, sorry, just to go back a little bit, I mean, you're saying that what they're given is their hands are tied and they can't do any better, but I mean, there's examples. There was one I saw recently in London where they were going to take this old block, which was quite sort of beautiful in an old English way, and then they were just going to kind of put this square sort of glass and steel thing above it for 5 stories or whatever they were doing. Why can't they just go up and keep the sort of architecture that was the stone and brick architecture? What would be illegal about that? What would stop them from making something like that? The Supreme Court in the United States is a beautiful building. Very imposing, magnificent, really sort of stands for what it is when you stand in front of it. Why can't we build like that? What happened to Greco-Roman sort of design? Why are we, is it a lot of brutalist type of design, which is unpleasant for the most part? There are some examples where you're like, okay, it's interesting to look at. But for the most part, a lot of these things are just sort of giant concrete blocks with a little bit of an inflection point here or there to train the eye to it. What's wrong with building with columns and pillars and using this classical design?
I think it's a good question. I think it's a perfect storm of a lot of things. But look, there's some amazing buildings going up and amazing architecture that we're sort of more privy to know where to look for them and which publications. But I think we might be a response to the fact that we don't really have a shared public domain anymore. Your public domain is your car and wherever you can see out of your window. So there's no need to address the civic spaces anymore. It becomes, once again, just an object. There's no, it becomes a brand of a building. Nothing wrong with that, but once again, it doesn't fit together to delineate a public space or to have an urban fabric or to have a...
It just seems to me that a lot of people have no taste. If I'm building a building for 20 billion rand in the center of Sandton, and you present to me this sort of kind of semicircular, wavy steel and glass structure, I'm going to go, that's okay. It probably works as a building. But anything that will actually look nice in 20, 30, 40 years. So I don't know if it's a combination of people with just incredibly poor taste, with no real understanding of history and what's architecturally beautiful, or people who've clearly never strolled through the streets of Europe anywhere, because that's the one thing about Europe that's magnificent, is you will walk down the street and every sort of third place is either a museum or a theater, and the architecture is magnificent. Sometimes on it's inside at the bottom now there happens to be a supermarket, but the outside of the supermarket is the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. And it's just odd to me that nobody kind of goes, well, we want what we're designing here, what we're paying for as a company to represent our brand. I agree with you on the brand front, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of corporate offices been built in Sandton in the last 10 years. And none of them really stand out. I mean, they do these funny things where they do lines down the side of the building, then they light the lines.
It's supposed to look like an exoskeleton, like the bird's nest, but it's a fake one now. It's all part of postmodernism as well, it's sort of, which is a whole another
discussion.
Sure. And highly contested of what it really means. Everyone sort of weaponizes it to mean whatever they want it to mean. But
that's the advantage of postmodernism. It doesn't have any meaning. But
as a brand, if I was a corporation, I would want a beautiful building that anyone could feel like they could visit. And I want them to be able to visit. Okay, they can't go like into my office as a CEO. There will be security. But at the bottom of the building, if you live in a walkable city, the bottom of your building will have places that people will want to go to. A restaurant, a coffee shop, a theatre, whatever, a cinema. So people will still go to your building anyway because it's a nice place to be, but they may not just go, will stroll into the CEO's office. But why can't, I went to Discovery the other day for something, the physical building. You have to sign in as security when you park. You have to sign in as security when you enter the building itself. Once you enter the building, there's like a large sort of circular corridor, if that even makes sense. And you got like a Woolworths food and Seattle coffee and all this other cuck. Lots of light, no natural light. All the air is reconditioned and recycled air, like purified and aircon. But it's a very well built prison. That has the good coffee because there's a Seattle and the Woolworths. But I mean, there's no sense of, is this a place that people would want to be in if they had the choice?
Once again, I don't think it's a bad architect or something. I think it's just the rules that sort of forced their hands into that typology. But touching on security, it's also interesting if you look at the V&A, for example. Because they own the streets, that makes it more possible for them to have their own sort of police, private security force there. And there's never police brutality in the V&A. They've customers first. So and also people feel safe there, and the businesses in effect sort of have privatized security everywhere that they club together. There's also a big incentive for them to keep the place secure, otherwise they're going to lose business. So a lot of our towns, as I'll get back to the point I was going to go as these old inner parts of town that has become unsafe, and whatever they try to do, safety can't be guaranteed there by the state. So they're also not allowed to have private security on the street because they don't own the street. And because of that and other reasons, and the car being subsidized and zoning, the whole city sort of sprawls out. Now it happens that someone think, okay, we need a place. It's a great opportunity for a developer to build a mall somewhere, but he's not going to build it right next to it. He's going to build it where he can catch someone else, close to a freeway and highway, or do we say freeways or highways? Close to a highway, and to get people from other little towns there as well. Now the whole town is sort of sucked in that direction, but the city councils and the zoning restrictions wouldn't allow that to become a new polycentric hub almost. They say no, you have to preserve the sort of rural character of that area. So they only allow single residential with low density per hectare with monocultures there. So you get this mall and you get a lot of little residential estates around it, and afterwards you get a tile patio warehouse and this. I can drop you anywhere in South Africa, you wouldn't know where you are. You can play like a game anywhere in South Africa. And you can't even walk from that little
strip mall.
Have you ever tried to walk from your little estate, even if here's my fence and it's just right over there is the mall. You have to walk all the way around. And as a person, you can't walk into a mall. You have to be a car. Sometimes you have to walk through the booms or whatever to get there. But if you look back to the security of the V&A. So now there's a lot of more porosity possible. You don't get these only single controlled little campuses. Everyone in Joburg has to have his own perimeter fence, his own security. So in that sense, security is just sort of pooled together, and sort of instead of everyone has his own fence, it's a fence around the whole sector. And hopefully you can, expand that better. So now there's a lot more porosity. A building can have multiple entrances. It can have more spaces that's semi-public and semi-private, where people can meet and all kinds of things can happen. It's always interesting. Patrick Schumacher talks about the sort of post-Fordism era we're living in, where people would more roam around freely for interactions, and sometimes a building like the skyscrapers we talked about, should have more semi-public spaces inside, So it can be a great tool to increase all of these connections that we're looking for in the geometry of a city, to be connected underwise and from the top. So buildings can be, maybe connected at the top, but they need to have maybe different atriums and where spaces can happen to, and those become sort of little public spaces. But to dictate that would be quite hard. The interaction of people's preferences need to sort of shape this over time. And it helps if it's a lot of micro developers rather than just macro developers. Like we also see in South Africa the solution. It's sometimes more of a housing solution, and then afterwards you try to put amenities and businesses there with all those sort of new fake cities we that sort of plan.
The white ghettos, like Dainford, right?
Yeah. Normally you'll get a successful CBD or a successful place where division of labour can happen, and then mass housing would follow that sort of naturally, if allowed. But it's not allowed in cities anymore.
Yeah. So, just to, we've been around an hour, just to end off, unless you have a question, John, just to end off, Tienie, is there any real area in the world where people are building now in contemporary times, but they are doing it, if I may say, correctly, in your view? Are there still elements of that, or is it all like just postmodern glass and steel nonsense?
No, there's wonderful. That is wonderful architecture and wonderful new. People are realizing this whole thing is completely crazy. So there's a lot of movements in the world, that start to sort of look at alternatives, building alternatives to this, So no, I think there's a big revolt on the way against all of this mindless zoning, but it's hard to roll back this system. But so I'm very optimistic that we're gonna, people are going to look back at this era and just thought, what were we thinking? It's crazy.
Yeah, because Trump signed an executive order that said any new federal building.
Did he sign that?
Yeah, apparently he did. Or it was.
Or maybe it's his plan.
It was on the table.
Yeah, any new federal building will need to have classical architecture within it. It can't be modern. But in Hungary, under Viktor Orban, who's a right-wing populist, the public buildings that he is building, I saw one that was built in 2017. You would think it's from 1730. Like it is a direct copy with all the local contemporary amenities, but it fulfills the civic function and is still beautiful, which is great.
Yeah, but that's, if it becomes prescribed, it's wrong again. So then it becomes sort of a themed architecture. So if that's really a true response to the context and the building materials that is possible, then it's fine. But say if we look at like a project with 3 private cities now, so we look, instead of to model this with AI of how this thing is going to emerge, which I find troublesome anyway. We look back at history that went through this trial and error, and we can learn a lot from that, but it doesn't mean that anyway. So, but we have to plug in new things, like how would the old cities have coped with Uber and cars and with steel that is cheap, and all of a sudden you can have glass facade. Surely they would have used it. So I don't think it will necessarily look like. So if you allowed those civic buildings that you spoke about to be experimented with all of this, and the architecture that will come out of that would be a much better response, and probably look much better than that. So, but the problem is why we get what we do is because of the urban grain. So I don't mind so much the how the building itself. Well, it's not really true, but for me, it's more about the urban fabric and how they fit together to make communities and streets and.
Lastly, just on the zoning point, would you be pro no zoning whatsoever?
Yes, definitely.
So then, because we've had examples of this in Johannesburg where people break zoning laws. So assumptively, if there were no zoning, then they wouldn't be breaking a law, and it would be fine for someone to open up their 500-person church in their converted house with the marquee attached to it on the front garden. And on, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays to just run services with blaring noise and all the rest of it next door to your property. that would be perfectly acceptable. And, if I wanted to open up a chemical store next door to your property because, I'm going into that business and I'm going to be keeping a number of different chemicals, including hydrochloric acid and nitric acid and all the rest of it. You've got nothing to say about that because we have no zoning law. So it's only reasonable. And if something goes boom, or you can't sleep and your kids can never get any work done, homework done, or whatever it is, your problem. How does that work with
So instead of having
zoning laws?
Instead of having this blunt instrument of zoning laws for everything to break these organisms apart, you can look at the little base rules. And in the old days it was and should be, and that's the most elegant solution, is you should expand property rights. So by expanding property rights, I mean, say in South Africa, you just, in most of the places in the world, you own something in a very 2D way. You own it from sort of heaven to hell is the principle that you own your property. But if I can't own a piece above you unless it's through other type of schemes that comes with other acts and. But if you expand property rights to say I can own a view, even if I don't even live there, I can own someone else's view or this or that, and all of these things are sort of voluntary. I can own silence, I can own the right to light, I can sell that to someone else. There's a market where these things can be traded, and in that way. All of these problems can be solved. So now in that example, if someone starts an activity in a residential area, he'll quickly be taken to court because he violates the property right. So
is there a precedent for that, for owning silence or on your property or owning...
Yeah, different places in the world as well. New York has the air rights that you can sell and people can, trade in that.
It's an interesting concept. But wouldn't you need a whole bunch of laws to enforce
it went around. Well, most of it would be voluntary in any way. So
I'm just thinking on the coast, for example.
Yeah.
If you've got the ocean is over there, but it's it goes up from the beach in a sort of
and someone builds
slope
in front of you.
Yeah, and there's enough space for six rows of houses. Who owns the view?
Yeah, well, that's
the guy in the
because
front who can
in
build
South
as high as he
Africa,
wants, or the guy at the back, or the guy in the middle.
Yeah. So in South Africa, there's a lot of, every now and again it gets to the Supreme Court and they also split.
I know of a case.
They always split on what their answer should be. Because they can't deal with it. This top-down system can't deal with it. It needs to arise out of property rights. You need to expand it. And then it's voluntary. Everyone knows, and you can easily keep track of it, that I own this and we trade it. And if you build up there, you're not allowed to, I'm going to take you to court or going to seize your building. But you can buy those rights from me. And then it becomes, then the sort of social costs of everything gets internalized with that. So so in Ocean View Drive in Cape Town, where you're not allowed to build above it because people driving there needs to have a view of the ocean. But what's more important, for people to have housing or for people to drive to see the ocean for kilometers at end? How do you... Where's
Definitely
the market?
For me to drive, because I'm never going to own one of those houses.
So where's the market that sort of prioritizes that?
But it's also about dominion. Like, I'm actually a fan of privatizing beaches, like Clifton Beach. I think the people that have property rights in Clifton should be able to dictate what happens on that beach.
That's very interesting. It's like the waterfront owning their own streets.
Exactly.
The community itself can own. It's much better to decentralize ownership like that.
Yeah.
So say if the community in Ocean View Drive, the people would like to... So the people in front, they have property rights and they have rights to build up. But now someone and people said, no, we want this as a scenic drive. So they can crowdfund it and they can go around to everywhere that uses it and they can maybe all give 10 Rand a month. And what they do is they put it in a sort of land trust and they, if someone else builds above that, they sort of just pay the difference. They sort of buy out the rights, to build above that. Mm. And if that eventually becomes so expensive, then surely they're going to say, okay, now we're going to allow a portion of it to be built up. And in that way, it can be a response to to society's wants and needs. And also keep in mind, you have an ecology of other stuff. There's other polycentric cities going on. There's not so many cars. There's not so many zoning. So there's not so much pressure on just one city to densify insanely. So if you take all of these things into consideration, it's much better. Another point I forgot to make is about pollution. So in the zoning thing as well, so say someone next to me, it's an activity, chemical stuff or whatever, and he pollutes the river. Maybe the river is owned together, it's part of a park, it's owned together by the neighborhood, and they can take him to court. So now his activities either needs to cease, or he's going to have to make a deal with them to clean it up and pay that. And so that way, say he's making whatever widget or I don't know. So now his product is going to... the cost of the pollution is going to be internalized into his product. So this whole idea of externalities isn't a problem anymore. So now, in that way, and this is through property rights that this happens, those externalities gets internalized and passed on to the consumer. So now we don't have to rely just on the morality of a consumer not to buy this. There's a definite, it's priced in there if you should buy it or not, which is a much better way in any way than carbon counting that people would like to go to. But with that way, you don't even need carbon counting because it's internalized in any way.
Yeah, well, basically contracts and property rights.
Yeah.
And the way you make those malleable solves a lot of issues. It's weird. People actually solve problems without the state.
Yes.
I know it's weird, people, but it does happen. I want coffee immediately. I look for someone who has coffee and I say, can I buy coffee from you? And they give me my coffee because I pay them money.
And it's all voluntary.
They
and there's
solve
still
the
rules.
problem. And this can apply to anything.
And there's still rules because he voluntary, is paying an insurance policy and submits himself under those rules of the insurance policy. So if he burns you with coffee or it's poisonous or whatever, he's going to pay up.
Still going to suffer for it, yeah.
Cool. Right. I like that. People can solve all problems without the state. I think that's always a good way to end the podcast. So, Tienie, thanks so much. Thanks for joining us. Much appreciated.
Where can people find you, Tienie? If you want to be found, of course.
Yes, that'll be nice, actually. I'd like to mention that for our Free Private Cities, we're also running an internship. So it's non-paying. We're all voluntary, giving our time at the moment for this until there's something concrete going. So to help us with the urban solution of that, so people that's maybe studying architecture or looking for an internship or would like it as a thesis topic, so we can help them and also teach them more about market urbanism if they're interested in that sort of way. So you're welcome to email me at tiniegrobler@gmail.com. So it's TIENGROBLER@gmail.com. Or otherwise, you can email me at martinez@mgarchitects.
Awesome. All right. Well,
perfect. Well, Tienie, thank you. Illuminating as always. I think this has been a year in the making, if I'm honest, because this is something that really interests me.
Yeah.
And I've known Tienie for a while. So thank you very much for
Thanks so
traveling
much. It's nice
all the way from Pretoria to Johannesburg. I know it's, especially with the pandemic, a lot of checkpoints, a lot of fights that you have to drive around.
Absolutely.
So we do appreciate it.
We make jokes now, but who knows in a couple of weeks
who knows,
with the hysteria that is. Cool. As always, you can find us at Ramon Cabernac, at Jonathan_Witt, at Renegade_Report. And we will catch you next time. Thanks so much for watching and listening. Cheers.